Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Malloy, and this is lecture 15.3, Patterns of Life. Self-sufficiency. This has long been a value in Chinese society, and most likely developed because of the distance peasants felt from their divine leaders, or emperors. This distance and very different way of life from the near deity who ruled over them will result in a sense of self-reliance that can still be seen in modern China today. We've already learned about China's system of rule by dynasties that lasted from 1650 BC to 1911 AD. We know the leaders of a dynasty would claim the mandate of heaven, which was essentially claiming a divine right to rule. The ruling family or dynasty would provide for people's basic needs and build up their empire's infrastructure. But over time, this dynasty would weaken, and soon, perhaps exacerbated by natural disaster or another event, the dynasty would lose power, allowing a new dynasty to claim the mandate of heaven and begin ruling. This process was able to continue for thousands of years for many reasons. One of those reasons includes the social hierarchy created under Confucian values in society. The social hierarchy set up under Confucianism is fundamentally unequal, with each member of society expected to fulfill certain obligations depending on their designated place. These Confucian beliefs help maintain order in society. The Chinese social hierarchy was topped off by a group of nobles called the gentry, and these were the wealthiest landowners and Confucian scholars. Often this class of people had long fingernails, proving they did not need to work with their hands. People in the gentry class often held government positions. The second social class in China was the peasant class. Peasants were farmers. Some farmers were wealthy, but the vast majority of peasants were poor. Village life emerged across China, and these peasants often felt far removed from their emperors or the gentry. The lowest social class in China included the artisans and merchants. They were below farmers because it was thought that they gained money from other people's hard work or labor. In Chinese society, people who labored with their hands and produced food were held in higher esteem. Although artisans and merchants were of lower birth status, they often became very rich. One of the cool aspects of the Chinese social hierarchy was that although it was fundamentally unequal, people could move up in society. So that's called social mobility. And social mobility in China was possible within one's own lifetime. This differs considerably from another social hierarchy that we studied earlier this year. Remember the caste system in India? Under the caste system, one was confined to one's assigned caste by birth and remained there until death, when it was hoped that one would be reborn into a new caste. Well, in China, one could advance up the social ladder by educating one's children. Families would invest lots of money in their oldest sons with the hope that they could take the civil service examinations and become a scholar or government official. This is an example of a merit-based system. It wasn't enough in ancient China just to have money. One also had to pass the civil service exam as well. Did you know that we have a civil service exam for certain government jobs today? Yep. Police officers, postal workers, government administrators each have exams attached to them. This is to make sure that the most qualified people get the job. In ancient China, family life was incredibly important, and family relationships were based on all of these Confucian values and traditions. So it wasn't just the civil service system and their social hierarchy, the family was based on Confucian values as well. We've already learned that Confucius founded this philosophy around 570 BC, and his thoughts were later compiled in a book called the Analects. Confucius's teachings emphasized the need to respect one's elders or superiors and to set a good example for those below you. It was by doing this, Confucius believed, that order, stability, and harmony were maintained in society. Things would basically stay in whack, not out of whack. Most Chinese families in ancient times were joint families. This is a really important term. A joint family included multiple generations. These are similar to the extended families that we learned about in our Africa unit. Unfortunately, poorer families struggled to survive, and they often lost many family members to hunger or disease. Wealthier families had better survival rates and often included many generations under one roof. Children were expected to adhere to the Confucian value called filial piety. Filial piety means faithful respect to your elders. The elders or oldest members of a family commanded obedience and respect no matter what. Punishments for children who disobeyed were often quite harsh. An old Chinese proverb reads, quote unquote, "The bamboo stick makes a good child." Speaking of proverbs, folktales were super important to the early Chinese. With many people lacking literacy skills, folktales allowed people to pass on stories and history via oral tradition. Many of these stories focus on filial piety and being rewarded for obeying one's elders. Filial piety also required younger family members to make offerings to one's ancestors as a sign of respect. Family rituals often included food and clothing offerings to ancestors who lived in parallel universes, it was thought. These rituals were often part of village holidays and other celebrations like births and marriages. Speaking of marriage, just like in India, the Chinese had an arranged marriage process in place. Parents would look for appropriate matches for their children, often attempting to move up the social ladder by a favorable match. But remember, the only real way to move up the social ladder was to become, yes, that's it, well-educated and take an exam. Matchmakers were in charge of arranging the match, and dowries were paid to the bride's family. Throughout Chinese history, the birth of a daughter was not considered a cause for celebration because women were considered inferior to men. Female children were seen as workers and would leave their own family once married in order to live as part of their husband's extended family. In her new joint family, she was required to obey her mother-in-law and serve her. A woman could only gain respect by giving birth to many sons. Filial piety prevented daughters-in-law from criticizing their mother-in-law. Around 950 AD, the Chinese adopted a practice called foot binding for women. Because smaller feet were considered more attractive than big feet, families would tightly bind a 3- or 4-year-old's feet with fabric and rope, preventing them from growing. The disfigurement was pretty terrible, not to mention incredibly painful. Many women had trouble walking or moving around. Some people believed this was a way to suppress women and keep them in their homes, which certainly is true. They were less likely able to run away from their husbands, and they were often confined to their homes because it was just too painful to walk. Many parents disliked this practice, but they felt they had no choice for their daughters, as their lives often depended on their daughters marrying into a proper family, and no guy, they felt, would want a wife with big feet. The process of foot binding was banned in the early 20th century. All I have to say about that is, with my size 10 feet, I would have been in trouble in Chinese society. Anyway, to summarize today's lesson, we've learned that family life dominated all aspects of people's lives in ancient China because of the distance people felt from their emperors and leaders. Chinese society was divided into a social hierarchy that was heavily influenced by Confucian values. People often lived in large joint families with a family relationship governed by the concept of filial piety. Boys were valued more than girls in society, and boys were encouraged to become scholars or gentry members by taking part in civil service examinations. Women's lives revolved around childbearing, with value placed on sons and small feet, which led to the horrible practice of foot binding. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.